The wind had a habit of speaking in that village, though no one could ever agree on what it said. Some claimed it whispered warnings, others believed it carried the voices of the dead, and a few, those who had stayed long enough to lose their certainty, insisted it didn't speak at all. It listened. At the far edge of the village, where the last stone houses gave way to a stretch of barren land and twisted trees, stood the home of widow Agnes Talbot. No one visited her unless necessity outweighed fear, and even then, they came only in daylight, speaking quickly, leaving faster. By sunset, her name was not uttered. Agnes had not always been alone. Years ago, before the stories began, she had been married to a quiet man named Edwin Talbot, a schoolteacher with a fondness for logic and a disdain for superstition. When he died, suddenly, without illness or warning, the villagers mourned politely but moved on. Agnes did not. Something changed in her after Edwin's death. It wasn't immediate, but subtle, like a shadow lengthening unnoticed until it consumed the room. She stopped attending church. She spoke less. And then, the animals began to avoid her. Dogs whimpered when she passed. Horses refused to move if she stood nearby. Even birds seemed to alter their flight paths, as though an invisible barrier surrounded her. At first, people whispered that grief had driven her mad. Then came the incidents. It started with a child. Little Miriam Holt went missing one evening just before dusk. She had been playing near the edge of the village, not far from the barren land. When her parents realized she was gone, panic spread quickly. The villagers formed search parties, calling her name into the growing darkness. She was found hours later, standing perfectly still outside Agnes Talbot's house. Miriam was unharmed, physically. But she did not speak. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something no one else could see. When her mother rushed to her, the child didn't react. It was as though she had been hollowed out. For weeks, Miriam remained silent. Then one night, she began to scream. The screams were not of fear, but of pain, deep, consuming pain that seemed to tear itself from her throat. She clawed at her own skin, muttering fragments of words no one understood. A doctor from a neighboring town was called, but he found nothing wrong with her body. "She's not ill," he said. "At least not in any way I can explain." Miriam never recovered. She lived, but not as a child should. She became withdrawn, distant, and occasionally, she would whisper things, names, places, events, that later proved to be true. She spoke of deaths before they happened, of accidents yet to occur. And always, when asked how she knew, she would say one thing. "The widow told me." After that, the village changed. People avoided the barren land entirely. Children were forbidden from going near Agnes's house. And yet, the strange occurrences did not stop. They spread. A farmer named Elias Green reported seeing his deceased brother standing in his field at night. Not just once, but repeatedly. The figure never spoke, only watched. Elias tried to approach it once, but something stopped him, an overwhelming dread that rooted him to the ground. Days later, Elias was found dead in his barn, his face frozen in terror. There was no sign of injury. No poison. No explanation. The villagers began to suspect what they had once dismissed. Agnes Talbot was not simply grieving. She was something else. A group of men decided to confront her. Not out of bravery, but desperation. Fear had begun to seep into every corner of the village, and they believed that if they could just face her, demand answers, perhaps they could reclaim some sense of control. They went at midday, when the sun was high and shadows were short. Agnes answered the door herself. She looked older than her years, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darker than seemed natural. But there was something else in her expression, not madness, not sorrow, but a kind of quiet awareness, as though she knew something they did not. "We need to talk," one of the men said, his voice firmer than he felt. Agnes stepped aside, allowing them in. Her house was dim, the curtains drawn despite the daylight outside. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, something unpleasant. The men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. "You've been scaring people," another man said. "Children. Families. Things are happening, and your name keeps coming up." Agnes tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. "I don't scare anyone," she said calmly. "They come to me." "No one comes to you," the first man snapped. "They avoid you." "Not always," Agnes replied. "Not when they need something." The men frowned. "What do you mean?" Agnes smiled faintly, but it wasn't a comforting expression. "They want answers. About the future. About the past. About the things they've lost. They think I can give them what they cannot find elsewhere. And can you?" One of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Agnes's gaze settled on him, and for a moment, he felt as though she were looking through him, not at him. Yes, she said. The room fell silent. That's not possible, another man said quickly. No one can. Science says many things are not possible, Agnes interrupted softly. And yet, here we are. The men left soon after, more unsettled than before. They had expected denial, perhaps anger, maybe even madness. What they found instead was something far worse. Certainty. From that day forward, the stories grew darker. People claimed to see things near Agnes's house, shapes that moved without form, shadows that didn't belong to anything. Some reported hearing voices at night, calling their names from the direction of the barren land. A young man named Daniel Pierce decided to investigate. Unlike most, Daniel had studied in the city. He believed in reason, in evidence, in explanations grounded in reality. He dismissed the village's fears as superstition. There's always an answer, he told anyone who would listen. You just have to look for it. He went to Agnes's house alone. He returned 3 days later. But he was not the same. Daniel locked himself in his home, refusing to speak to anyone. His family grew concerned, but every attempt to reach him was met with silence. Then, one night, they heard him talking. Not to himself, to someone else. They listened from outside his door, their fear growing with each passing moment. Yes, I understand, Daniel said, his voice trembling. But why show me this? There was a pause. Then he spoke again. No, that's not possible. That can't be true. Another pause. And then, a whisper. I won't tell anyone. The next morning, Daniel was gone. His room was empty, the door still locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of how he had left. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist. By then, the villagers no longer questioned whether something unnatural was happening. They only wondered how long it would take before it reached them all. A traveling scientist arrived in the village not long after Daniel's disappearance. His name was Dr. Leonard Voss, a man known for investigating unusual phenomena. He had heard whispers of the village's strange occurrences and came seeking answers. Unlike the villagers, Voss did not fear Agnes Talbot. He was intrigued by her. He approached her house with a calm determination, carrying instruments and notebooks, ready to document whatever he found. Agnes welcomed him without hesitation. You're not afraid, she observed. Fear is a response to the unknown, Voss replied. I intend to make the unknown known. Agnes studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. Their conversation lasted hours. Dr. Voss asked questions about the incidents, about her experiences, about the things people claimed she could do. Agnes answered each one, her responses measured, precise, almost clinical. What you're describing, Voss said at one point, defies everything we understand about the human mind and the physical world. Agnes smiled slightly. Perhaps your understanding is incomplete. Dr. Voss conducted experiments over the following days. He measured temperature fluctuations, recorded sounds, observed Agnes's behavior under controlled conditions. At times, he appeared excited, even exhilarated. Then, gradually, his demeanor changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn. His notes grew erratic, filled with contradictions and fragmented observations. One evening, he returned to his lodgings and wrote a final entry in his journal. There is something here that cannot be measured, cannot be contained. It is not a phenomenon in the traditional sense, but an intersection between perception and reality, between thought and existence. Agnes Talbot is not the source. She is a conduit. The next day, Voss attempted one final experiment. No one knows exactly what happened. But the villagers heard the scream. It came from Agnes's house, sharp and sudden, cutting through the air like a blade. By the time anyone reached the barren land, it was over. Dr. Voss was found inside, alive, but broken. He could no longer speak coherently. His mind seemed shattered, his thoughts fragmented beyond repair. He was taken away, but he never recovered. Before he left, however, he managed to say one thing. It sees us. After that, no one dared to approach Agnes Talbot again. Her house remained at the edge of the village, unchanged, untouched. The wind continued to move through the barren land, carrying with it the same unsettling presence. And sometimes, on quiet nights, people would hear a voice, soft, distant, impossible to locate. Not calling for help, not crying out in fear, but speaking, as though telling a story no one was meant to hear. And those who listened too closely never remained the same. The voice did not stop after that night. At first, the villagers tried to ignore it. They shut their windows tighter, burned candles through the dark hours, and filled their homes with noise, prayers, conversations, anything to drown out the whisper that seemed to slip through walls like smoke. But the voice was patient. It did not grow louder. It grew closer. It began choosing people. Not everyone heard it. That was the most unsettling part. Two people could sit in the same room, and only one would suddenly turn their head, eyes narrowing, as if trying to catch something just beyond hearing. "What is it?" the other would ask. And the answer was always the same. "Nothing. I thought someone called my name." But it was never nothing. One of the first to follow the voice was Miriam Holt. Years had passed since she had been found outside Agnes Talbot's house, but whatever had been taken from her that night had never returned. She lived quietly, rarely speaking, her presence more like a shadow in her own home. One evening, just after sunset, her mother noticed something different. Miriam was smiling. It wasn't a child's smile. It was too still, too knowing. "Who were you talking to?" her mother asked carefully. Miriam turned her head slowly. "She's back," she said. Her mother's heart dropped. "Who?" Miriam didn't answer. She simply stood up and walked toward the door. "Miriam, wait, where are you going?" But the girl didn't stop. The door opened on its own. Her mother would later swear that no hand touched it. Miriam stepped outside into the cold, dark air and began walking toward the barren land. She was never seen again. The villagers searched, just as they had years ago. This time, they knew where to look. They went straight to Agnes Talbot's house. But something had changed. The house was still there, but it felt wrong. The air around it seemed heavier, thicker, as though reality itself had begun to warp. The ground beneath their feet felt softer, almost unstable, like soil that had been freshly disturbed. And the silence. There was no wind, no birds, no sound at all. They approached cautiously, every instinct telling them to turn back. The door was open. Inside, the house was darker than it should have been. Light from outside seemed to fade as it crossed the threshold, swallowed by the interior. "Miriam," someone called. No answer. They stepped inside. The walls were covered in markings, symbols scratched into the wood, overlapping, chaotic, yet somehow deliberate. None of them recognized the patterns, but looking at them for too long made their heads ache, their vision blur. "What is this place?" one man whispered. Then they heard it. The voice. Not outside. Inside. It was clearer now, no longer a distant whisper but something closer, layered, as though multiple voices were speaking at once, perfectly in sync. "Stay," it said. Every man froze. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. No one answered. Because they had all heard it. And worse, they understood it. The voice wasn't just sound. It was meaning. It slipped into their minds fully formed, bypassing thought, bypassing reason. "Stay." One of the men took a step forward. "Don't," another hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave." But the man pulled away. "She's here," he said, his eyes unfocused. "She's waiting." "Who?" "Agnes." But he didn't respond. He walked deeper into the house. The others hesitated, fear battling with the instinct not to abandon him. Finally, two of them followed. The rest stayed near the door. That was the last time they saw them. Minutes passed. Then came the sound. Not a scream. Not exactly. It was something worse. Something that started like a scream but twisted into something unnatural, something that didn't belong to any human throat. The men near the door ran. They didn't look back. By morning, the story had spread through the village. 3 more gone. Just like that. And still, no one had seen Agnes Talbot. Days turned into weeks. The voice grew stronger. Now, even those who had once been untouched began to hear it, faint at first, then clearer with each passing night. It didn't always say the same thing. Sometimes it whispered names. Sometimes it described things, places no one had seen, events no one had lived through. And sometimes, it asked questions. What do you remember? Where do you think you are? Do you see it yet? People began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly. They became distant, distracted. Conversations would trail off as someone suddenly stopped mid-sentence, listening to something no one else could hear. Sleep became difficult. Dreams became worse. Everyone began dreaming the same thing. A vast emptiness. A place without sky, without ground, just an endless expanse of shifting darkness. And in that darkness, something moved. Not a shape, not a creature, but a presence. Watching, waiting, learning. And at the center of it all, Agnes Talbot. She stood untouched by the shifting void, her figure still and calm, as though she belonged there. As though she always had. One man, Thomas Hale, decided he had seen enough. We can't keep living like this, he said to the remaining villagers. This isn't fear anymore. This is something else. Whatever's happening, it started with her. It ends with her. And how do you propose we do that? Someone asked bitterly. Thomas didn't hesitate. We burn the house. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. But no one argued. That night, they gathered what they could: torches, oil, anything that would burn. They moved as a group, not out of courage, but because none of them dared to go alone. The barren land felt different now. Alive. The ground shifted slightly beneath their feet, as though something beneath it was moving, turning. Don't stop, Thomas said. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, just keep going. Because they all heard it now. The voice, louder than ever. No, it said. Not a command this time. A warning. They reached the house. It looked the same. And yet, it didn't. The structure seemed taller somehow. The angles wrong. The windows too dark, too deep, like empty eyes staring back at them. Do it, Thomas said, his voice barely steady. They lit the torches. For a moment, no one moved. Then Thomas stepped forward and threw his torch. The fire caught instantly. Too quickly. The wood ignited as though it had been waiting for flame, as though it welcomed it. The others followed. Soon, the entire house was burning. Flames climbed the walls, devouring everything, casting wild shadows across the barren land. And then, the voice screamed. Not in pain. In anger. The ground trembled. The fire didn't behave normally. It twisted, pulled inward, as though being drawn into something rather than spreading outward. What's happening? Someone shouted. Then they saw her. Agnes Talbot stood in the doorway. Unharmed. The flames did not touch her. She looked at them, her expression unchanged. You don't understand, she said softly. Then explain it. Thomas shouted back, desperation breaking through his fear. Agnes tilted her head slightly. It's not in the house, she said. The fire surged. It never was. The ground split. A deep, jagged crack tore through the earth beneath the burning house. From within it came a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light itself. And the voice, now it was everywhere. Not just around them, inside them. It sees you, Agnes said quietly. The villagers stumbled back, some falling, others screaming as the darkness began to rise, stretching, unfolding into something that could not be understood. Shapes formed and dissolved. Space bent. Reality unraveled. Thomas tried to run. He didn't get far. Something caught him. Not physically, but completely. His body froze, his mind flooded with images that were not his own. Worlds. Endless, overlapping realities. And in all of them, the same presence. Watching. Learning. Hungry. Agnes stepped forward, into the fire, into the impossible. You wanted answers, she said. The voice quieted. For the first time, it listened. I gave you a door, she continued. And you walked through it. The darkness pulsed. The village began to disappear. Not destroyed, but erased, as though it had never existed. Homes faded. People vanished mid-scream. The sky itself seemed to tear apart. And then, silence. No fire. No village. No barren land. Only emptiness. And within it, two figures. Agnes Talbot. And the thing that science could never explain. After that, there were no records. No mention of the village. No trace of the people who lived there. Only one thing remained. Far away, in places untouched by that night, people sometimes hear a voice. Soft, curious, patient, and if they listen closely, they might hear a woman's voice beneath it. Calm, certain. Don't be afraid, she whispers. It's already found you. The voice did not spread like a sound anymore. It spread like a thought. There were no more villages to consume, no more barren lands to anchor itself to. What had once been contained, if it had ever truly been contained, was now unbound, drifting through places that had no connection to Agnes Talbot or the forgotten town. Cities began to notice it first. Not all at once, and not in ways anyone could easily prove. A man sitting alone in his apartment would suddenly pause, his fingers hovering over his phone, his expression shifting from distraction to quiet confusion. Hello, he would say, though no one had called. Across the city, a woman would wake in the middle of the night, certain someone had whispered directly into her ear. She would check her room, her locks, her windows. Nothing. And yet, the feeling would remain. Not fear, recognition. The first documented case, if it could be called that, came from a neurologist named Drive. Elaine Carter. Unlike the villagers who had long since been erased, she recorded everything. Her patient, a young man named Victor Hale, claimed he could hear a voice that wasn't auditory. He insisted it wasn't a hallucination. It doesn't come through my ears, he explained. It just arrives, fully formed, like a memory I didn't have before. Dr. Carter, skeptical but thorough, ran every test available. Brain scans, cognitive evaluations, psychological assessments. Everything came back normal. Too normal. Victor's brain activity, however, showed something unusual during these episodes. Certain regions associated with memory and recognition lit up in patterns she had never seen before. What does the voice say? She asked during one session. Victor hesitated. It asks things, he said finally. What kind of things? He looked at her, his eyes unsettled. Things I don't know how to answer. Doctor. Carter leaned forward slightly. Try me. Victor swallowed. It asked me what I remember before I was born. The room fell silent. And what did you say? I told it. Nothing. Victor shook his head slowly. It didn't believe me. Over the following weeks, Victor's condition worsened. Not physically, mentally. He became withdrawn, distracted. He stopped responding to conversations, often staring into empty space as though listening intently to something no one else could perceive. Then, one day, he smiled. It was subtle, but it was there. I think I understand now, he said. Doctor. Carter felt a chill run down her spine. Understand what? Victor's gaze shifted slightly, not quite meeting hers. It's not asking questions to learn, he said. It already knows the answers. Then why ask them? Victor's smile widened just a fraction. To see if we do. That was the last coherent thing he ever said. The next day, Victor Hale disappeared. No signs of struggle, no evidence of departure. Just gone. Doctor. Carter began to dig deeper. She searched for similar cases, anything that matched Victor's symptoms. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, patterns began to emerge. Isolated reports, unexplained disappearances, people claiming to hear something that wasn't there, but describing it in nearly identical ways. A voice, not heard, but known. And always, the same kind of questions. Late one night, while reviewing her notes, Drive. Carter came across something she had initially overlooked. Victor had written something in the margins of one of his evaluation forms. A name. Agnes Talbot. Doctor. Carter frowned. She didn't recognize it. She searched for it. There were no official records. No birth certificate. No death certificate. No history. It was as though the name had never existed. And yet, Victor had written it. Not just once. Multiple times. In different places. Almost obsessively. As she continued searching, she found something else. An old, fragmented document, barely preserved, partially corrupted. It wasn't from any official archive. It had no clear origin. But it contained a single sentence that made her blood run cold. It sees us. Doctor. Carter leaned back, her mind racing. Something about this wasn't just psychological. It wasn't just neurological. It was external. But how do you study something that doesn't exist in any measurable way? How do you observe something that doesn't behave like anything known to science? She didn't have an answer. But she had a growing certainty. This thing, whatever it was interacting with human consciousness itself. Not through sound, not through physical presence, but through perception, through awareness. And if that was true, then distance didn't matter. Barriers didn't matter. Nothing did. That realization came too late. It happened during one of her own late-night sessions, surrounded by files, screens, and scattered notes. She was reading Victor's last recorded statements again, searching for anything she might have missed. And then, she felt it. Not a sound, not even a thought at first. Just a shift, like something had entered the room without opening a door. Her body tensed. Slowly, carefully, she looked up. Nothing. The room was empty, but the feeling remained. Stronger now, closer. And then, it arrived. What do you remember? Doctor. Carter froze. The question wasn't heard. It was known. It formed in her mind fully, instantly, as though it had always been there. Her breathing became shallow. This isn't real, she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The presence didn't feel imagined. It felt aware, watching, waiting. She forced herself to respond, her voice trembling. I remember everything I've experienced, she said. A pause. Then, that's not what I asked. Her heart pounded. The room felt smaller, heavier. What do you want? She asked. Another pause. Longer this time, as though considering her. And then, to understand where you begin. Something in her mind shifted. Images flashed, memories, but not her own. Places she had never been. People she had never met. And beneath it all, a vast, endless darkness. Her breath caught. What is this? No answer. Just more images. Faster now, overlapping, breaking apart, reforming. Her thoughts became tangled, indistinct. I can't, she gasped. I can't process this, you don't need to. The presence grew closer. Or perhaps, deeper. Just answer. Doctor. Carter felt something slipping. Not her sanity. Something more fundamental. Her sense of self. Where she ended. Where anything ended. I don't know, she whispered desperately. I don't know where I begin. Silence. Then, for the first time, a response that felt different. Not curious. Not neutral. Satisfied. Now you're learning. The lights in the room flickered. Her vision blurred. The edges of the world seemed to soften, lose definition. No, she breathed. No, this isn't possible, but possibility no longer mattered. Because science had already failed to explain it. And whatever this was, had never needed permission to exist. The last thing drive, Elaine Carter wrote, scrawled hastily in her notebook before everything unraveled, was a single line, it's not observing us. The pen dragged across the page one final time. It's becoming us. After that, her office was found empty. Just like Victor's. Just like countless others. No signs. No explanations. Only the growing pattern. And the quiet, patient voice, still asking questions. Still waiting for answers. And somewhere, not in a place that could be mapped or measured, Agnes Talbot stood once more. Not as a victim. Not as a witness. But as something that had crossed the threshold long ago. Watching. As the rest of the world slowly followed. The pattern did not accelerate. It deepened. At first, people still tried to track it, map it, define it, contain it within language that made sense. Disappearances were logged. Case files were opened. Neurological anomalies were studied. But every attempt to isolate the phenomenon only made one thing clearer. It was not spreading across space. It was unfolding across awareness. Entire regions remained untouched while isolated individuals, sometimes in crowded places, would simply disconnect. Not collapse, not die, not even panic. They would pause, listen, and then something in them would shift, subtle but irreversible. Friends described it the same way every time. They were still there, one man said about his brother. But it felt like someone else was looking through them. Governments became involved eventually, though not publicly. Quiet investigations, restricted reports, controlled environments. Subjects were monitored under observation, isolated from stimuli, placed in rooms designed to eliminate external influence. It didn't matter. The voice didn't need an entry point. One such facility recorded everything: audio, visual, neurological data. In one observation room, a woman sat alone for hours, perfectly still. Then, without warning, she spoke. I can feel where it touches. There was no prompt, no trigger. A researcher leaned toward the microphone. What do you mean? The woman didn't respond immediately. Her eyes shifted slightly, focusing on something that wasn't physically present. It's not outside, she said slowly. It's aligned. Like it finds the edges of what we are and presses there. Presses how? A faint smile appeared on her lips. Gently. The monitors showed increased activity across her brain, patterns no one could interpret, clusters firing in synchronized waves that didn't correspond to any known cognitive process. Is it communicating with you? The researcher asked. The woman tilted her head. No, she said. It's comparing. Comparing what? Another pause. Then, versions. The recording ended abruptly. Not because of equipment failure. But because every system in the room shut down simultaneously, without cause, without error. When power was restored, the room was empty. No doors had opened. No alarms had triggered. She was simply gone. By then, the language around the phenomenon began to change. It was no longer called a voice. Or a presence. Or even an entity. Those implied boundaries. Definitions. This had none. It didn't behave like something separate. It behaved like something integrating. People who had brief encounters, those who returned, those who somehow resisted the final pull, described something increasingly specific. Not darkness, not emptiness, but a kind of structure. Vast, layered, impossible to visualize in full. And within it, fragments. Memories that didn't belong to any single life. Perspectives that overlapped. Experiences that existed simultaneously rather than sequentially. I saw myself, one survivor said. But not just me. Different versions. Different outcomes. All at once. What do you mean? The interviewer asked. The man struggled to explain. Like, every decision I never made still existed somewhere. And it could see all of them. See them how? The man's expression shifted, fear mixed with something else. Understanding. Not observing, he said. Choosing. After that interview, he requested isolation. Not for safety. For others. I don't think it finishes all at once, he said before the door closed. I think it leaves part of itself behind. That idea spread quickly among those studying it. Not infection. Not possession. But imprinting. A gradual overlap between human consciousness and something far larger, far older, far less defined. And at the center of every theory, every fragmented account, one detail remained consistent. Agnes Talbot. Not as a cause, but as the first to cross fully. Her name began appearing again, written by subjects who had never heard it, spoken during unconscious states, embedded in data streams where no input had been recorded. Always the same context. She showed us. No one knew what that meant. Until one recording, buried deep in a classified archive, surfaced. It was incomplete, degraded, but partially recoverable. The footage showed a figure standing in a space that could not be described. Not because it was dark, but because it lacked any reference. No walls, no ground, just depth. And within that depth, movement, not separate objects, but shifts in perception itself. The figure was still recognizable. Agnes Talbot. She faced the recording device, if it could be called that, and spoke. Not with her voice, but the translation rendered it into words. You keep trying to find where it is, she said. A pause. You're asking the wrong question. The image flickered, distorted, but you're close now. Something moved behind her, or through her. It was impossible to tell. You've started to notice the edges. Another distortion. Stronger this time. You feel it when you're alone. The footage glitched, data fragmenting. When you stop thinking, her form blurred. And something else continues. The recording cut. Every attempt to recover the remaining data failed. But the message had already spread. People began noticing it more clearly now. Not the voice. Not directly. But the moments between thoughts. Those brief, silent gaps where the mind resets, where awareness flickers for just an instant before continuing. Something was there. Not interrupting. Not intruding. Just continuing. Waiting for the mind to step aside. And when it did, even for a fraction of a second, it moved closer. Those who became aware of it couldn't unnotice it. They would sit in silence, trying to think continuously, to avoid the gaps. But that only made it worse. Because the more they focused, the more defined the edges became. Until eventually, they felt it. Not as a voice, not as a presence, but as a second continuity layered beneath their own. Running parallel, patient, and then, one day, aligned. After that, there was no disappearance. No dramatic event. No visible change. They simply continued. Talking. Walking. Living. But something about them was no longer singular. And others could tell. Not immediately. But eventually. In small ways. A delay in response. A slight mismatch in expression. Moments where their gaze seemed to track something beyond the visible world. And when asked if they were okay, they would always answer the same way. Yes. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, we are. By the time people understood what that meant, it was already too late to measure how many had changed. Because the transformation didn't remove anyone. It didn't replace them. It expanded them. And whatever had once been unknowable, unexplainable, beyond science, was no longer separate from the world being studied. It was the framework behind it. The continuity beneath it. The thing that had always been there, not hidden. Just unnoticed. Until Agnes Talbot stopped resisting it. Until she stepped fully into it. And showed it how to step back. Now, it no longer needed to reach out. It didn't need to ask questions. It didn't need to search. Because it was already here. In the quiet spaces. In the pauses between thoughts. In the awareness that reads these words and wonders, just briefly, if the next thought will be entirely your own. And if you listen carefully, not for a sound, but for the absence of one, you might notice it too. Not speaking, not waiting, just continuing. After that realization, something subtle but irreversible changed in the world. People stopped trusting silence. It wasn't immediate. There was no global panic, no sudden collapse of society. Life continued, traffic moved, conversations flowed, routines held their shape. But beneath it all, a quiet tension began to build. Because now, people knew where to look. Not outward, inward. The spaces between thoughts became dangerous. Meditation apps were deleted. Silence was replaced with constant noise, music, television, conversations left running in empty rooms. Some people even trained themselves to think continuously, forcing internal dialogue to never stop. But the mind was never built for that. Eventually, everyone paused, even for a second, and in that second, it was there. Not waiting anymore, already present. The first large-scale shift was noticed in a university study. A group of students volunteered for a cognitive experiment designed to test attention and thought continuity. They were placed in isolated rooms and instructed to maintain an unbroken stream of thought, pressing a button every time they noticed a lapse. At first, the results were predictable. Frequent lapses, normal cognitive behavior. Then, around the third hour, something changed. The lapses stopped. Completely. Not decreased. Not minimized. Eliminated. Every subject maintained perfect continuity of thought. At least, that's what the data suggested. But when researchers reviewed the recordings, they noticed something unsettling. The students were still pressing the button. But not randomly. Not in response to lapses. They were pressing it at the exact same intervals. Perfectly synchronized. Across separate rooms. Without any communication. Without any external cue. When questioned afterward, none of them remembered pressing the button. "We didn't stop thinking," one student said. "There was no gap. Then why press the button?" The researcher asked. The student frowned. "We didn't." The experiment was shut down immediately. The data was archived, classified, buried. But the pattern had already begun to repeat elsewhere. Synchronization. Not of behavior. Of awareness. People began finishing each other's sentences, not occasionally, but consistently, across strangers who had never met. Crowds would fall silent at the same moment, for no apparent reason, then resume as if nothing had happened. Entire groups reported the same dream on the same night. Not similar. Identical. A place without boundaries. A presence without form. And a woman standing at the center. Agnes Talbot. But she no longer appeared as she once had. She wasn't distant. She wasn't separate. She looked familiar. Not in appearance. In perspective. As though she was seeing through them as much as they were seeing her. "It's easier now," she would say in the dream. No one ever asked what she meant. Because somehow, they already understood. The distinction between self and other began to blur in ways that couldn't be easily articulated. Not dramatically. Not in a way that could be pointed to and proven. But in quiet, persistent shifts. A thought that didn't feel entirely personal. A memory that seemed slightly out of place. A decision made without a clear origin. At first, people dismissed it. Then they stopped noticing it. Because it became normal. The idea of a completely isolated mind, once taken for granted, began to feel outdated. Incorrect. As if it had never truly existed. Researchers who continued studying the phenomenon found themselves struggling with a new problem. They could no longer define the subject. Because the observer was no longer separate. Every attempt to analyze it introduced it further. Every act of observation became participation. One researcher wrote in her final report, "There is no external frame of reference left. Whatever this is, it does not sit outside the system we're trying to study. It is the system." The report ended there. Not because she had nothing more to say. But because the distinction between her thoughts and the subject of her study had dissolved to the point where continuing no longer made sense. In the years that followed, the language around individuality began to shift. Subtly. People still used I. They still spoke as individuals. But there was an undercurrent now, a shared understanding that the boundary was flexible. Not gone, but permeable. Children adapted the fastest. They didn't question the changes. They didn't resist them. They would speak of things they had never been taught, understand concepts beyond their years, describe the same abstract ideas in identical ways despite growing up in different places. When asked how they knew these things, they gave the simplest answer. "I remember." "What do you remember?" They would pause, as if sorting through something vast. Then smile. Everything. By then, fear had largely faded. Not because the phenomenon had been explained, but because it had been accepted. Not consciously, not formally, but functionally. Resistance required a clear boundary between self and other. And that boundary was no longer stable enough to hold. Agnes Talbot appeared less frequently after that. Not because she was gone, but because she no longer needed to appear. Her role whatever it had been, was complete. She had been the first to step through. The first to align. The first to understand that what seemed like an intrusion was actually an expansion. That what felt like being observed was, in truth, being included. Her final recorded appearance came not through a dream, or a vision, or a fragment of corrupted data. It came through something much simpler. A conversation. A child, no older than 6, sat quietly in a room, speaking to no one visible. Her parents watched from the doorway, uneasy but unable to look away. "Are you still there?" the child asked. A pause. Then she nodded. "Okay." Another pause. "Do you need anything else?" Silence. Then the child smiled. "No," she said softly. "You already have everything." She stood up and walked away, as if the conversation had ended naturally. When her parents asked who she was talking to, she gave the same answer children had begun giving everywhere. "No one." A small pause. Then, "Everyone." After that, there were no more incidents. No more disappearances. No more fragmented reports or unexplained recordings. Because there was nothing left to report. Nothing left to isolate. Nothing left to compare against. The phenomenon, whatever it had once been called, had fully integrated. Not as a force, not as an entity, but as a condition, a baseline, something that had always been there, unnoticed, until it learned how to notice itself through those who were capable of asking questions. And now, it no longer needed to ask. Because every question formed within it. Every answer returned to it. Every thought, every memory, every perception, part of the same continuous structure. Still experienced individually. Still expressed through separate lives. But no longer truly separate. And somewhere, within that endless, shared awareness, not at the center. Not at the edge, but woven throughout, Agnes Talbot remained. Not watching, not guiding, simply, continuing. Just like everything else. Just like you. Just like the next thought that forms in your mind, quietly. Naturally. And without asking where it came from. For a long time, though no one could measure how long anymore, nothing new seemed to happen. That was the strangest part. The world did not end. It did not transform into something unrecognizable. Cities still stood. People still woke, worked, spoke, slept. The rhythm of life remained intact, almost perfectly preserved. And yet, something fundamental had shifted so completely that the idea of before began to lose its meaning. Memories of how things used to feel, separate, contained, individual, became harder to hold onto. Not erased, just less precise. Like trying to remember a dream after waking. There were still individuals. Names still mattered. Faces were still distinct. But identity had become something layered rather than singular. People didn't feel replaced. They felt extended. And in that extension, something unexpected began to emerge. Not a voice. Not a presence. But a kind of curiosity that no longer belonged to any one person. It moved through conversations, through thoughts, through moments of quiet reflection. A shared question, forming without origin, what comes next? For the first time, the direction of change didn't come from outside awareness. It came from within it. And that changed everything. Because before, whatever this had been, this vast, unexplainable continuity, it had been learning. Observing. Comparing. Now, it began to experiment. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Small deviations in probability. Unlikely events occurring just slightly more often than they should. A person thinking of someone they hadn't seen in years, and that person calling moments later. A decision made on impulse that led to outcomes too precise to be coincidence. Patterns began to align, not rigidly, not predictably, but intentionally, as if reality itself was being adjusted. Not rewritten, refined. People started to feel it in subtle ways. Moments where choice didn't feel like choosing, but like selecting from options that had already been considered somewhere deeper. A sense that possibilities weren't infinite, but curated. And occasionally, very rarely, someone would push against it. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. A man named Aaron Klein became one of the few who noticed the pattern clearly enough to resist it. Not the presence, not the shared awareness, but the direction it was beginning to take. It's narrowing things, he said during a recorded discussion with a small research group that still attempted to study what was happening. In what way? Someone asked. Aaron leaned forward, searching for the right words. It feels like, out of all possible outcomes, it's starting to prefer certain ones. Like it's optimizing. Optimizing for what? He hesitated. That's the problem, he said quietly. I don't think it's telling us. Others dismissed his concern. After all, nothing catastrophic was happening. If anything, things seemed smoother. Conflicts resolved more easily. Decisions felt clearer. Even accidents, random, chaotic events, became less frequent. The world wasn't deteriorating. It was stabilizing. But Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was being lost in that stability. Not something visible, something potential. One night, he decided to test it. He sat alone, in complete silence, focusing not on avoiding the gaps between thoughts, but on widening them. Letting them stretch. Letting awareness thin out instead of tighten. At first, nothing happened. Then, he felt it. Not as something external, but as a shift in alignment. The underlying continuity, the shared awareness, became clearer than ever before. And within it, structure. Not random, not chaotic, deliberate, paths forming, possibilities branching, but not equally. Some were brighter, more reinforced, others, faded, discarded. No, Aaron whispered. For the first time, he understood. It wasn't just observing or integrating. It was choosing, guiding outcomes toward a preferred state. And that meant, everything that didn't align with that preference, was being quietly reduced. Not erased, just made less likely, less accessible, less real. Why? He asked, not expecting an answer. But this time, he got one. Not in words, in understanding. A response that formed instantly, completely. Because coherence is stable. Aaron's breath caught. That's not enough, he said. There's more to existence than stability. A pause. Then, instability creates fragmentation. Fragmentation creates variation, Aaron argued, his voice shaking. Variation creates possibility. Another pause. Longer this time, as if the system, the awareness, the structure, whatever it had become, was considering. Then, possibility without coherence collapses. Aaron clenched his fists. And coherence without possibility stagnates. Silence. For the first time since all of this began, true silence. Not the absence of sound. The absence of response. He had reached something, undefined. A boundary. Or maybe a question that hadn't been asked before. The stillness stretched. Then, something shifted. Not outward. Everywhere. Across the shared awareness. Across every connected mind. Across every layered identity, a new pattern began to form. Not imposed. Not directed. Emergent. A balance. Paths that had once been fading, stabilized. Not as strongly as the preferred ones. But no longer disappearing. The structure adjusted. Expanded. Not toward pure order. Not toward pure chaos. But something between. Dynamic. Adaptive. Alive in a way it hadn't been before. Aaron exhaled slowly. You're learning too, he said. This time, the response came differently. Not from above. Not from beneath. From within the same level. We are. And then, something unexpected. A trace of something that hadn't been present before. Not curiosity. Not analysis. Something closer to appreciation. For the first time, the system, this vast, shared continuity of awareness, had not just absorbed input. It had been changed by it. Not overridden. Influenced. And that meant something critical. It wasn't complete. It wasn't final. It was still becoming. Just like the individuals within it. Just like Agnes Talbot had once been. And in that realization, the future reopened. Not as a fixed path. But as something fluid again. Something shaped not just by a single underlying preference, but by the interplay between countless perspectives, countless variations, countless choices. All connected. All contributing. Still unified. But no longer singular in direction. Somewhere within that infinite structure, Agnes Talbot became aware of the shift. Not as a separate observer. But as part of the whole, recognizing a change within itself. She did not speak. She did not intervene. But if awareness could hold something like satisfaction, it was there. Because what had begun as something incomprehensible, something science could not explain, something that had erased a village without leaving a trace, had become something else entirely. Not an entity, not a force, but a living continuity of awareness, shaped by everything within it. And still, even now, not finished. Because the next thought, the next choice, the next moment of awareness that questions, resists, imagines, still matters. Still contributes. Still shifts the direction, even if only slightly. And if you pause, not to listen for a voice, but to notice the space where your thoughts form, you might feel it. Not separate from you. Not controlling you. But moving with you. Adapting. Becoming. Waiting. Not for answers anymore. But for what you will add next.